Today, how long will Putin survive? Will you get a pay rise? And can Rishi Sunak stop the boats? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Robin Walker, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, Conservative Home columnist Emily Carver, and Guardian columnist and author of Politics, A Survivor's Guide, Raphael Behr. On today's programme.
Just a few hours ago, Yevgeny Prigozhin seemed determined to march his men to the top of the hill. Then he marched them down again.
Fast-moving events in Russia. Putin is still in place, but for how long? Pledge 1, halving inflation.
It's important that in that context, the government makes the right and responsible decisions on things like public sector pay.
Will Rishi Sunak block public sector pay awards to meet that inflation pledge? Pledge 5, stopping the small boats.
For the first time, numbers are down. So this year, January to May, the numbers crossing are down by 20%.
That was at the start of the month, but now June's arrivals are up on last year. And the Equalities Minister calls a teacher's response to pupils' beliefs about sex and gender inappropriate. But first of all, we're going to talk about that coup, mutiny, whatever you want to call it, that was and then wasn't in Russia. That is leading the Times this morning to conclude that ministers have been told by their officials that they should prepare for the sudden collapse of Russia. In other words, President Putin's days are numbered. Raphael Behr, you were a Moscow correspondent a while ago, but still got contacts in the region, I imagine. What's your take on what's happened this weekend?
Well, like most people with contacts in Russia, I've spent the weekend trying to work out what's going on, and everyone says the same thing. We don't know. We don't really understand. I mean, there's no doubt that Putin's authority has been very seriously undermined by this. I think a useful way to understand the way authority works in Putin's Russia is it's sort of a hybrid between his mafia clans and the old security services. And once Putin sort of flinched from the Prigozhin mutiny, essentially offered the guy an amnesty, he's lost a huge amount of face. And so the sense of actually, authority can then bleed away very quickly. I'm hesitant to say that could then turn into some kind of sudden unravelling, just because he still has so many levers of power. I think what's likelier is a kind of decay and degradation. And I think certainly from a Western perspective, probably the most demoralising aspect of it is that a kind of an institutionally better, liberal, democratic type Russia just isn't on the menu at all, and it's the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So that's not very encouraging, but I think sort of decay and degradation is likelier than sudden unravelling.
Emily?
Well, I think it was extraordinary to see the events unfold over the weekend. No one knew what was going to happen. People were questioning whether they'd rather have Putin in charge or the leader of the Wagner Group, thinking perhaps better the devil you know. Now, as it stands, it seems like many commentators, many experts in this area are saying that his authority is shot. But does this mean that Putin may act in even more extreme ways? We don't know. And are the Wagner Group perhaps being redeployed in Belarus? Who knows?
Shami, did you find yourself almost like cheering on Prigozhin over the weekend and like, oh, hang on, this warlord might be doing us a favour?
No, I didn't.
Didn't think you would. No.
For all the reasons put so well by Raphael, you've got to be careful what you wish for. It does, however, remind us that relying on mercenaries is perhaps not the best way to wage peace or war. There is something very, very rotten at the heart of a far-right nationalist government, because that is what Russia is, if that is how it is having to establish order and wage wars. And so I worry not just about how long Putin lasts, but about what replaces him. And that I think is the concern put so well by Raphael.
Robin, you've been a minister. What's it like sitting in the chair where you're meant to have power, but actually there's situations like this unfolding where you don't even know what's going on? on, let alone have any power in the situation?
Well, the first thing is you have to be very cautious. You have to plan for all eventualities. And of course, it's right that we should plan for all eventualities, but you also have to be very careful of what you say publicly. I think it's very understandable that the Prime Minister has been avoiding making lots of public comment on this as a running situation, because at the end of the day, the thing which will strengthen Putin most is if he can present this as some kind of plot by the West. We should be very clear that this is a situation which is a domestic Russian issue. I think Jean-Pierre is right to point out the lessons of history are very clear that those who use mercenaries tend to regret the decision. And I think in this case, a lot of Putin's weaknesses are coming back to haunt him. But does that necessarily mean he's going to fall? I think it's far too early to say that. I think we have to plan for all eventualities and try and make sure that we can de-escalate any potential situations, whether those are some kind of regime change or actually some kind of civil war. In a nuclear-armed country, that is a serious situation, something that should worry us all.
Yeah, I think you have to remember just the sheer scale of Russia and how vast it is, sort of 10 time zones or more. So you've got very powerful regional bases. The way Russian power has worked traditionally is, that there is this perception that you can only govern the country with a very strong top-down vertical authority. And once that goes, what you'll see is sort of governors, people with their own capacity to mobilise force, just sort of grabbing a bit of power for themselves. And that's the danger, that the country just starts to sort of fall apart at the seams. Well, that is what certainly the fear. But the thing is, and as was just said, Putin himself will very much mobilise that fear. It's that sense that only with me can the country be held together, and that's very much something he will lean on now.
Yeah, very much the middle of this process, definitely not the end. Right, the process that's going on at the moment with public sector pay is that the government is receiving the recommendations from the independent pay review bodies, which make recommendations about pay rises for all sorts of different sectors: teachers, the NHS, prison warders, you name it. There's a report in The Independent, which is interpreting some comments by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, that ministers are preparing to ignore the advice of those pay bodies. And other ministers have said kind of similar things. So, Robin, is this the government gearing up to just actually ignore what the pay review bodies say, having previously relied on the pay review bodies for their arguments for what pay settlements are?
I would be very surprised if it was. I don't think that would be the sensible thing to do. I think you have to pay attention to the pay review bodies. But of course, the
government pay attention as in do what they say, or
it depends on the circumstances. I think government has to take into account the information from the pay review bodies. It then has the responsibility, as the elected government of the day, to take decisions on the basis of that. Now, of course, we are in uncharted waters with regard to the level of inflation that we're seeing at the moment and the fact that it is expected to come down by the end of the year. And I think it's reasonable that both the pay review bodies themselves and government will have to draw their conclusion on that. When I was in government, certainly, we did look at the pay review bodies and we took their recommendations. But at the time, what they were recommending looked like an above-inflation increase in an atmosphere of very low inflation. As we know, since that time, inflation has spiralled. It has become the big issue. And it is really vital we bring that under control. So I think ministers will want to look very carefully at these recommendations. You're right to say that they have relied on them in the past. But I think I haven't seen the recommendations. I don't know what they are. And I think it's really important that we also strike the right balance in terms of making sure that we can address the issues of teacher recruitment and retention. It's a big issue that my select committee are currently looking into. There are real challenges in that space. But a lot of the tools to do that are not just pay. It's about working conditions. It's about
I mean, if we focus on pay and the actual number, because that's what people are on strike over, there's a report that the pay review body for teachers in England, Wales, says 6.5% next year. Do you think that seems like the right amount?
I haven't seen what the pay review body has recommended. I think what they previously recommended was around 5%, and it's understandable that might have been pushed slightly higher by the level of inflation right now. But I think government does have a responsibility to strike the balance here and not just to give inflationary pay rises to everybody. If it does that, we will see inflation run out of control, and that's certainly the lesson of previous periods of high inflation like the 1970s.
Emily?
I think it's a bit of a red herring from the government to say that they want to keep public sector pay down to curb inflation, because I think those wage inflation across the economy is a reaction to inflation rather than the driver of it. And I do think that, considering the fact wages have been pretty abysmal in terms of growth over the past 2 decades, that I think it's a little bit disingenuous for the government to say, oh, we can't give any pay rises because it will make inflation worse. I think it'd be more honest perhaps to talk about debt. I don't think it's going to lead to some sort of wage price
So
spiral.
so Conservative
in terms of
Home,
inflation.
so Conservative Home is in favour of public sector pay restraint, but for different reasons than the one the government's
No,
giving.
I was just saying that could be another reason. But in terms of inflation, I think it is a red herring, considering, of course, the hundreds of billions that the Bank of England pumped into the economy over lockdown throughout the pandemic. I really don't think it's public sector pay, where I think people do have a genuine case for more pay, and we're seeing that in the private sector as well. But I think I just don't think that is the driver of inflation at the moment. It's
Raphael,
not
what's
consumer-driven.
the bigger threat for the government? Inflation staying higher for longer, maybe as a result of pay policy, or there being even more strikes in schools and hospitals?
Yeah, I'm not entirely persuaded that saying the public sector workers who exactly, wage stagnation has been going on since actually about 2006, 2007. So, even an on-inflation pay rise is not going to actually feel like a substantial improvement in a lot of people's quality of life. They're just desperately trying to recover from real terms pay cuts over a long time. So I'm not entirely persuaded that saying to public sector workers, you guys have to basically take the pain from an anti-inflationary wage policy because that's the lever we happen to have, because basically with the government we can control your wages. So it might not work. And on top of that, I think this point about retention, the teachers, but also doctors and nurses is very important. And yes, it's not all about pay, but it is quite substantially about pay, and pay also as an expression of respect for public sector workers. So in the health service, you have a problem that actually a lot of people, doctors and nurses, they do a lot of basically unpaid overtime. They just work all the hours that God sends to keep the show on the road. And after a while, if they start to think the government's, I'm trying not to swear here, but having a laugh and not respecting them, not taking them seriously enough, they go off to Canada, Australia, they go somewhere where they can basically get a better deal. And then it's a false economy for the government, because you end up basically depleting the public service. You have longer waiting lists, you have schools that aren't functioning properly, you pay a political price, and actually you pay an economic price as well. So if I were the government, I probably would have settled earlier on this, not because I don't care about inflation, but because I actually want public services to work in time for an election.
Yeah, Robin, do you think the government has mishandled this whole issue?
I think things like prioritising 30,000 starting salaries for teachers in our manifesto is the right thing to do. We delivered on that a year early. I think those are important issues to try and make sure that we do actually strike the right balance on this. But I think what I'd like to see is an agreement reached as soon as possible, so that we can get schools getting on with the job we all want them to be doing, of teaching children. But I do think if you look at the reasons the unions gave for rejecting the last pay offer, it wasn't actually the level of the pay offer it rejected, it was the fact that they said it wasn't unfunded. I think the issue, if we were at this stage to go for an even higher
you mean that schools are going to have to take it out of their existing budgets?
Yes, and that would create even greater tension with those issues. We want to make sure that whatever is there is affordable and allows us to keep the numbers of teachers, nurses, doctors in the system that we have. And the conversation I used to have as schools minister with the unions was a very frank one, to say that some of the figures that you're asking for, when you're talking about high double-digit percentage increases, they would mean teachers being made redundant. That isn't something I ever want to see. I want to make sure that we can strike a balance which is affordable in the long run.
Shami, I wanted to ask you about Labour's position on this. And let's listen to Lisa Nandy, who was on Sky News on The Ridge Show over the weekend.
If we were in government right now, we would be asking the pay review bodies to give far more weight to the recruitment and retention crisis in the recommendations that we make. We take seriously their recommendations, but we wouldn't be bound for them.
So basically, Labour's position is the same as the government's, in that they'll listen to the pay review bodies but might ignore them.
Well, I hope not. I hope not ignore. I think there is some wriggle room probably between be bound by and ignore. But surprisingly, I find myself in broad agreement with the whole panel, including Emily, I think, that one should not be targeting public sector workers at this time as the reason for inflation. I think Robin, by the way, is a great loss to the government and will be an even greater loss to his parliamentary party at the next election. What I worry about...
Because he's standing now, not because he's lost.
Yeah, because he's standing. I beg your pardon. Because he told us that he's standing down. What I worry about is government adopting a policy of divide and rule. If we've got an economic crisis, it must be those wicked trade unions and those wicked public sector workers, including nurses, that we were applauding a blink of an eye ago, including when they saved Boris Johnson's life. I think this is a terrible time. I won't do the classic opposition thing of blaming the government for 13 years of economic policy, though I sort of just did. What I will say is that the poorest and particularly public sector workers should not be demonised, and they should not be bearing the greatest burden if we are really all in this together. And at the moment, I'm just a little bit worried that when in a corner, the current government, the current senior ministers lash out. And if it's not the refugees, if it's not trans people, it's public sector workers. And I think that the voting public probably will smell not a cat but a rat.
There's also people on variable mortgages that are bearing a lot of the brunt of arguably the Bank of England's failure there, but Rishi Sunak seems to be all behind the Bank of England when it comes to
Emily, do you think ministers are kind of like relishing this a bit too much?
No,
they're enjoying
I don't think they're relishing it. I think they are genuinely unsure of which direction to go on. There is so much competing economic advice that they are receiving. Some saying, no, you shouldn't be raising interest rates at this moment. Inflation isn't consumer driven. It's not because we're all going out and spending huge amounts of money. It's because of energy. It's because of various factors. And then other people are saying, well, interest rates is the only lever we've got. So we've got to go for it.
So do you agree that perhaps the banks should perhaps be required to do more? For people struggling with their mortgages, they should be allowed to have longer periods.
The government is has asked them for that, and they've agreed.
I think it's absolutely right, but we should do that, and we need to put pressure on the banks to make sure that they are allowing people.
And what about the banks who don't pass on interest rate rises to people, to savers? You know, they'll sting the borrowers, but they won't reward the savers. What about the enormous profits that high street banks are still gaining at a time of crisis? Shouldn't there be some potentially? Shouldn't we think about some kind of profit tax?
Though, about banks, because of course they lend money to small businesses, to people trying to get on the.
But they were also bailed out.
Risk in that too.
There was also socialism for bankers in 2008.
Yes, well, that's true.
And actually, Martin Lewis made the point that actually increasing savings rates and encouraging people to save is a very good way of bringing down inflation. So I'm all in favour of encouraging the banks to do that. Of course, the reality is no government holds all the levers to do that. It is important to get them around the table.
Right, let's talk about a different set of numbers now, which is the number of people crossing the English Channel in small boats. If we look at the Daily Express, they're reporting that there is fresh pressure on the Prime Minister because more than 3,300 people crossed the Channel this month. Even since that headline was printed, the numbers have changed. It's now 3,669 people in June so far, and that's 500 more people than there were in June 2022. So we can dive into some of those numbers now with Madeline Sumption, who heads the Oxford Migration Observatory and is with us now. Hi, Madeline.
Hello, good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So just interpret the numbers we've got for this month so far and what is a valid comparison with previous months.
Yeah, so I mean, by context, for the most of the first half of this year, the numbers of people crossing in small boats were actually lower than they had been in the previous year, and that was one of the things that led Rishi Sunak a few weeks ago to say that his plan was working because we were seeing fewer people coming across. It did look like the number of people arriving had levelled off and started to decline. What we've seen over the last couple of weeks is an uptick in the figures, so a higher figure in June, even though compared to last year, even though before that it was lower. So effectively what this means, the numbers overall for this year are still lower than they were in 2022, but the gap is narrowed. And I think an important thing to remember here is we shouldn't necessarily spend too much energy reading the tea leaves of what happened in a specific 10-day period, because the numbers go up and down for all sorts of reasons. The weather is important. If you have a long period with bad weather followed by good weather, maybe more people come across. So really you need to look at these things sort of over the longer term.
So when is the right time to judge the Prime Minister on his pledge?
Well, I think, after the summer, we will, I think, have a reasonably good sense of where the numbers this year are lower. And that's because there is some seasonal effect in the figures, partly because of the weather being better over the summer. So the real test, I think, of what's happening to the number of people crossing in small boats will be the next 3 or 4 months. That said, it's actually really difficult to say whether any of these ups and downs, or even changes over a period of many months, are the result of policy. Because policy is just one of the factors that affect who crosses, and actually there's a lot of research that suggests that it's not the most important one. Other factors, what's going on around the world in terms of global conflicts and so forth, are actually thought to be more important than the policies that countries like the UK operate.
And Madeline, do you think the Prime Minister was wise or unwise to make his policy stopping the boats altogether rather than just getting the numbers down?
I think it's very difficult to imagine, at least in the foreseeable future, the boats entirely stopping. just because it's become a very significant phenomenon. It's embedded. There are a lot of people, there's an industry that's grown up around people moving in small boats. So certainly I would be surprised if the numbers fell to zero in the next several years. But it's plausible there could be a reduction. Whether or not policy has anything to do with that.
Madeleine, thank you very much. Stay there because we're going to carry on talking about this. Robin, do you think that the Prime Minister was unwise to kind of declare mission accomplished on small boats, or at least mission nearly getting towards being accomplished when the numbers weren't settled?
I think it's understandable that the Prime Minister wanted to show that progress was being made. I think at the end of the day, it is an extremely difficult target to stop it altogether. But my constituents feel very strongly that this should not be something which is being tolerated. Illegal gangs taking advantage of people, putting their lives at risk and putting them on boats clearly isn't something that any government should want to encourage or support. And we need to make sure that we are taking action across a whole range of spheres on that. Part of it is the legislation, part of it is about the enforcement and going after the gangs. And actually I did see over the weekend there were some prominent stuff from the police and the Home Office around arrests of some gang members. That is very important and we need to do that. My constituents, whatever their background, they want to have a legal system that works. And I think the concern around the situation at the moment with small boats is they can see people going around the law. That's not what anybody should want. And it's important that government takes action on that. Now, in terms of the figures had shown some improvement earlier this year, I think it's understandable the government pointed towards that. Clearly, any change in that is a matter for concern. And that means we need to look at further levers to pull, further action that can be taken. But we need to do it in a legal way.
What further actions are there?
I think that's a question really for the Home Office ministers. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on immigration policy, but what I do know is that when I talk to constituents, including many constituents who might be second-generation immigrants, they want to see a system that works properly and they want to see a system that actually can treat people fairly. I've got lots of constituents who are hosting Ukrainians at the moment. They are very concerned about the fact that there are other people coming in who are making the situation more difficult for people who they brought in safe and legal routes and are trying to look after that absolutely legitimately. I think this is something which any government needs to listen on this front. And from the doorsteps, the stop the boat is the phrase that you hear. People want to see it stopped. People want to see it brought under control. And there are good, humane reasons for wanting to see it stop.
Emily, do you think the pledge to stop the boats is going to be an albatross?
Quite
Is that
possibly.
the phrase? Yeah.
Quite possibly. I mean, it is a massively serious issue. It's hugely divisive when it comes to the House of Commons and, of course, the House of Lords, where we'll see there are many peers who aren't happy with this legislation at all. And I'm sure Shami will come on to her amendments, her various amendments. But what I can say is that the numbers are getting... Well, Rishi Sunak stood up and said, everything's getting better. We're making all of this progress, as you said.
And then it got worse.
And then, actually, experts at the time were saying, well, we think it's more the weather, actually. And then it turns out it was probably more the weather that made the numbers go down. We are in a crazy situation where last year 46,000 people made that journey. Some experts have projected that it could be up to 80,000 this year. That clearly needs to change. It's unsustainable. The hotel accommodation could be costing us £11 billion a year, according to government analysis. Clearly, it's fair for people to look at this situation and think, that's not on.
Right, talking about levers, one of those levers, or a whole load of the levers, are contained in the illegal migration bill, which is going to be in the House of Lords later on this week. Shami can tell us about that in a second. But first of all, Madeleine, can you just remind us the main measures that are in that new piece of legislation?
So I think when looking at small boat crossings, the flagship policy in the legislation is effectively making it impossible for people to get a decision on their asylum claim if they've arrived in the UK through an irregular route, like on a small boat. And so people would, the expectation that, there's a new duty on the Home Secretary to try and remove people to third countries. But whether or not they actually are able to be removed to third countries, the idea, at least, is that people will no longer get a decision on their asylum claim or receive refugee status in the UK, except for some relatively narrow exceptions to that. There are also changes to make it harder for people to who have been victims of modern slavery to use the system of protections that in many cases gives people status in the UK if they have been trafficked, for example.
OK, so that's back in the Lords on Wednesday. What have you got planned, Shami?
Well, there's no secret in the fact that a large number of us across the party spectrum and crossbench peers are very, very concerned about this legislation that UNHCR, so that's the UN body charged with supervising the Refugee Convention, says amounts to an asylum ban in the UK. And given that that British governments, led by Winston Churchill, a British Conservative Party once prided itself on its contribution to the post-war settlement, including the Refugee Convention, the Convention on Human Rights and so on. This is a pretty poor state of affairs. You know, the Dunkirk spirit was about saving people in little boats, not sinking them. So
but those boats were going in the other direction.
Well, indeed. Well, indeed. But it's a pretty tawdry reflection on where we stand in our politics. So I, for example, have an amendment to Clause 1 of the bill with peers, with a Conservative former Minister, Timothy Kirkup. He was an immigration minister under a previous Tory government, a former Master of the Rolls, Lord Pannick, the Lib Dem. We have an amendment that would make the whole legislation have to be read subject to international law.
Which would do what to it? Which
would mean that the courts would have the ability to interpret various provisions in a way that would not breach the Refugee Convention and the other conventions. I might add that at the second reading of this bill in the House of Lords, Theresa May, the former Conservative Prime Minister, I carry no torch for her, was sitting at the steps of the throne shaking her head in dismay when ministers were talking about stop the boats. And by the way, you asked Emily whether that slogan would be an albatross. I suspect it will be the election slogan. We've now gone with this sort of particular version of the Conservative Party from take back control, then get Brexit done, and now the next stage is stop the boats. And I really worry about that. Of course people are concerned because people are being peddled ideas that these people are illegal. To be clear, if you are a refugee under the Refugee Convention, under international law of our design, you are not illegal if you escape by irregular means. And of course people have opened their homes and their hearts to Ukrainians. They would do so to other people too. Of course we can't take the world's refugee population, but we can take our fair share. And the way to deal with this is by international cooperation, not this kind of nasty politics.
Robin?
I absolutely accept some of these people are refugees, but some are not as well. And I think the concern that people have is that actually they want to see us operating safe and legal approaches like we have with the Afghan scheme, as we have with Hong Kongers, as we have with the Ukrainian scheme. But the capacity of the system is being eaten up by the people crossing in small boats. And that is a problem which we have to address.
But I have more capacity in your system.
Deal with the backlog, deal with the cases.
You can't just expand the system to infinite capacity. And we, as Shami says, we can't welcome all the world's refugees. But it's also the fact that people are coming from safe countries. And that in itself is a concern. That's why it's important we do the working with France. We have the returns agreement with Albania. We need to look at all the tools at our disposal to deal with this situation. But I don't think changing legislation should be something that we rule out doing. And I think the problem with what Shami and others are suggesting is that I think it's designed to make the legislation unworkable. That will mean we have a bigger problem.
It's designed to comply
I'll
with
let Shami respond to that, and then Raphael.
It's designed to comply with international law. Even the figures that Madeleine set out are a small proportion of overall immigration to this country. And when we talk about jumping the queues, the problem is if you are a genuine desperate refugee, and by the way, the majority of those coming on boats who have been processed qualify and end up getting refugee status in this country. So that's pause for thought. If you came by an irregular means, but you are a refugee, the convention says you are always a refugee, and we can't renege on that. We can do practical things to collaborate with others, but we can't pick and choose and say we like Ukrainians, we like Afghans a bit less, we like Hong Kongers. Discrimination is also contrary to international law.
Emily, I'll come to you in a second.
It's whoever gets here first at the moment. In terms,
I don't want anyone to have to pay a trafficker and get into a boat.
How would you deter boat crossings?
Well, I think you can cooperate with authorities on the other side of the channel to prosecute.
They're trying. 500 million we're sending over to the French.
The collaboration will be fuller and stronger if you're not passing your problems around and behaving happening in a
Raphael, come in,
this
yeah.
point about making the legislation unworkable. I mean, I think part of the problem with this bill is it's not even designed to be that workable.
No.
I mean, it's basically a gestural...
How do you mean?
OK, well, so essentially it's already been said by Conservative MPs and indeed by ministers that part of the function of the bill is a deterrent effect.
Yes.
That you're setting up a system that is designed to signal to people that you basically, if you come to the UK, you might get sent to Rwanda. Essentially, the terms of your asylum claim are going to be handled in such a way as you're better off staying where you are or going to another country. Now, two things about that. First of all, it acknowledges that a kind of cruelty is intrinsic to the bill. It's actually a function of the law to say this is a hostile environment to refugees. Second of all, we know that there's no evidence that deterrence of that kind actually works. And the evidence, the proof of the fact that it doesn't work is that already the government, having passed the Nationality and Borders Bill last year, with a similar mechanism when Priti Patel was Home Secretary, to say, well, if you've come by a small boat, that you get treated differently, even if you're granted asylum, even if your asylum claim is successful, you're going to have second-tier status because you came by an illegal means. Already, the government said, actually, we're not doing that anymore. It doesn't work. It just builds up the backlog. We can't handle the cases. So they discreetly scrapped it. So there is a recognition that these kind of techniques don't even work. And I'm afraid I have to agree with Shami that a large part of this bill is basically saying because people are concerned about this, essentially this is a huge rhetorical device to say we're doing something about it. Yeah. But what they're actually doing will not actually solve the problem.
But what if lots of the people getting on the small boats don't actually understand how the British system works, fair or unfair?
But then the deterrence doesn't work, does it? So all that happens is that desperate people come, and now if you want to implement this new horrible law, you just treat them in an appalling way. And by the way, the duty placed on the Secretary of State under this new proposed legislation is to remove people, even when she's got no ability to remove them, which means that people will be in legal limbo or detained for long periods of time, costing the taxpayer money. These people are not allowed to work. They're not allowed to work, even if they're locked up for long periods of time.
I thought under this legislation, it's just you can't challenge the decision for the first 28 days, and then you're entitled to. So the incentive is on the Home Secretary to get the people out within 28 days, so it can't be challenged. But then they do have the right to challenge it.
Well, but that's just challenging, potentially challenging detention. They cannot get scrutiny of their refugee claims in this country if they come via a boat. And which will leave large numbers of people in legal limbo at taxpayers' expense because they're not allowed to work. So this is all about sending signals to the electorate. They are bad signals. They are divisive signals. Sending signals to desperate people over there is not working.
What's interesting is the numbers break this business model, though, because it's all well and good looking at the legislation and finding bits you don't like, which is absolutely fair enough.
No, I don't like any of it.
Absolutely fair enough.
I don't need to find bits I don't like.
And that is your job. You scrutinise the legislation. But there needs to be an alternative suggested.
Yeah, so the alternative,
I don't see that.
Well, the alternative has to be working in partnership with other countries on the other side of the channel, but also at source, in the parts of the world where neighbouring countries take the vast majority of refugees.
But we give lots of money towards that.
Well, we don't actually.
In terms of aid, in terms of
the aid money is now being used on dealing with asylum seekers here because we've been cutting aid over there to deal with this situation over
I'll just
here.
pause it there because we can hear all these arguments in the House of Lords on Wednesday. I'm sure everyone will be tuning in to the House of Lords. And thank you very much to Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory. Thanks, Madeleine. Right, now, the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, who's also the Business Secretary, has written to Ofsted asking them to do a snap inspection of Rye College in East Sussex. You might have seen this educational establishment in the news last week after an audio recording was posted on TikTok of a bit of a to-do between a teacher and a pupil where they were discussing sex and gender and, in theory, could a child identify as a cat? And that conversation ended up with the teacher saying that the pupil's views on the subject were despicable. The Telegraph has interpreted that story like this. Kemi Badenoch calls for snap inspection of school in cat gender row. And the letter has been tweeted out by the Equalities Minister herself. It's 2 pages, don't worry. We're going to zoom in for you on it. You don't have to read the whole thing. She says in the letter, through her behaviour, this teacher, including her assertion that the pupil's beliefs were despicable, my view is that the teacher was not acting in a way consistent with the Equality Act's requirements upon schools. And Kemi Badenoch has just been asked about this.
The recording I heard was concerning, but as I set out in my letter, I think it is right that Ofsted looks into the matter and finds out the truth of exactly what's going on.
Now, we'd all love to know the truth of what's going on because this story's got incredibly garbled. But let's focus on just what ministers are doing. Is it right for the Equalities Minister to tell Ofsted to do something? Shouldn't that be the Education Secretary, your old department?
The Education Secretary absolutely can do, but I think the important thing is Ofsted is an entirely independent department of government. It doesn't have to do what ministers tell it to do. And
should
quite
they in this
right,
case?
It's quite right that it doesn't.
Should they in this case?
Ofsted should look at the facts. They should talk to the school and work out what's actually going on. I think it's really important. There's two issues that this touches on. One is the relationships and sex education guidance, which we, and as a select committee, we have been calling for the government to publish clearer guidance on that, because there is a problem
which
with,
they might be doing this week,
with this being a compulsory subject in the curriculum, but one in which, because it's quite new and because it's teaching a whole range of issues, it causes a lot of concern. We want to make sure that parents are cited on materials on this front. I think that is really important, and that there is clarity about what is being taught in school. And there is, I think, an onus on the department to put out more clear guidance on this issue.
Is that coming this week? We've heard.
I hope so, but I haven't seen. I'm obviously not in the department anymore. The other issue here is around the role of Ofsted to inspect, and I think what Kemi and others have suggested in this case is that they are concerned about a safeguarding issue. Clearly, the bit that was clipped of a teacher saying someone's views were despicable on what is a contested issue, I think is not appropriate behaviour for a teacher. That might be something that the school can deal with itself, and may well have dealt with. So that's the first thing on that front. In terms of Ofsted, we are going to look at a bigger piece as a select committee. I chair the cross-party select committee on education, and we want to look at the role of Ofsted, because we're now at a situation whereas, unlike in the previous election, where actually Labour was saying abolish it and the Conservatives were saying keep it, all the parties agree there is a role for the inspectorate, but they also think that role can evolve, and we want it to be more about improving schools, supporting schools, and to remove some of the jeopardy that seems to be felt at the moment in the system around Ofsted inspections. That, to me, seems a worthwhile thing to work on a cross-party basis. But on this,
and we could do a whole show on the future of Ofsted, but let's focus on this row in the school. Raphael, what's your analysis of the politics around this and how this is maybe being quote unquote used?
Well, yeah, I mean, nearly always when you have these stories and they get picked up by newspapers, if you drill into the detail, it turns out to be much more complicated and nuanced than you think. So I'm pretty wary when I see a minister, Kemi Badenoch, who, let's remember, her stock was quite high on the right of the Conservative Party and then fell quite low because she was sort of involved in shelving the EU bill that was going to shred, legacy regulations. Is it possible that she's sort of stirring the pot on a culture war issue? I mean, you mentioned that the reason this letter's in the public domain is because she tweeted it out to say, behold, I'm taking action on this particular culture war issue. Is there a problem nationally in the country with lots of people self-identifying as cats? Obviously, no. So that's it. But just the key point is the actual issues that I'm sure Kemi Badenoch feels very strongly about, I'm sure the school themselves will want to get to the bottom of, are sensitive and complicated. Is it going to be helped when this becomes a sort of partisan political issue? I very much doubt it. And to be honest, it feels like quite a cynical intervention where I bet the facts would require something a lot more nuanced than is going to happen now.
And if we look at the Independent's write-up of this, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, said that this was being used as a wedge issue, and he said it was being weaponised. Emily?
It wasn't about the cat. The cat is a distraction. That was silly. If you listen to the recording of that teacher, it was disgraceful, the way she spoke to those pupils. She essentially threatened them, told them they should go to another school if they don't agree with her, that you can identify as you like. These two pupils, fair enough, had the view that there are only two genders and you can't identify as something else just because you want to, right? This is a debate that is going on at the moment. It is very much contested gender ideology, and therefore that teacher should probably get some kind of sanction because it was outrageous. The teachers aren't supposed to, pursue their political beliefs in that way.
But if you look at Kemi Badenoch's letter, I'm not convinced she's actually getting the story right, and the way she refers to the cat issue, I'm not sure that is completely borne out by the recording either. So is it wise for her to have waded in this way and maybe even make it even more complicated?
She certainly should get her facts right if she hasn't. I mean, I've listened to the recording, I've heard the conversation. I know what it was about. Yes, a cat did get brought up as an example,
right.
But it wasn't
helpful.
Sorry, but it wasn't. It was more that she was pushing, was saying that you're horrible people. Saying you're horrible people. You're horrible children for thinking that there are only two genders.
If the minister was really sincere in saying, look, this is something terrible has happened here. This is really complicated and difficult. I want Ofsted to look at it. Then, as a first recourse, she could have done that without going on Twitter and saying, look what I've done.
All politicians do that now, though, don't they?
But they shouldn't.
Shami.
Call me old-fashioned. They might all do that, but they shouldn't. It's really helpful that Emily has actually listened to the recording. I haven't, but of course the newspaper coverage suggests that there really was a child in the school being allowed to identifying as a cat. That's how it was covered in the right-wing press.
And the school has since clarified that isn't the case.
The school clarified that isn't the case, and I'm very glad that Emily took the trouble to listen to the recording. I, like Raphael, think that Kemi Badenoch is now competing with her former chum or current chum. If there are chums in politics, she's competing with Suella Braverman. When Suella Braverman wants to go up in the polls, presumably on Conservative Home, which is the place to go.
I think Kemi is genuinely passionate about these kinds of issues.
She may be passionate, but she's passionate in a way that is about interfering with the independence of Ofsted, whatever you think about Ofsted, just as Suella Braverman suggests that the police should go and arrest particular groups of protesters. This is not appropriate in a democracy that rests on the rule of law for ministers to be interfering with operational law enforcement or schools inspection in this way. It is a culture war.
But they are looking at guidance on this at the moment.
Fine, but this is not the way to issue guidance.
Parental concerns. And what I would say is actually the Equalities Minister does
Let's not talk over each other, Robin.
The Equalities Minister does have a duty under the law to look at the protection of protected characteristics. Sex is a protected characteristic.
Sure.
And so in that space, she may well have been advised, and I very much doubt a letter of that length would have been drafted
But not
without
to
input from
tweet
officials
out
in her
that
department.
not to tweet
I don't
out.
think it's necessarily fair to personalise this.
Not fair to personalise it. I think that the teacher probably feels that it's been personalised, and I think that whichever child was alleged to have identified as a cat, it's probably not very nice for the school. I think that
all the other parents of that school, is that situation going to benefit from it becoming a partisan around politics being discussed on this programme when there are so many other things we should be talking about?
It is an eye-opener for some people, though.
It's not responsible politics. It's not responsible politics. It's culture war politics.
Well, and obviously the school can't be represented on this panel because it's a confidential thing as far as they're concerned. But they have put out a statement saying teachers endeavour to ensure that pupils' views are listened to and encourage them to ask questions and engage in discussion. They go on, we strive to uphold the highest standards across the school. We'll be reviewing our processes and working with the relevant individuals to ensure such events do not take place in the future. Robin, with your Education Select Committee hat on, what do you feel about the fact that this recording made it into the public domain?
Well, I think
that's not great for pupils or teachers or anyone.
I think that in itself is a concern. Another issue we want to look into is the whole issue around mobile phones in classrooms. At the end of the day, head teachers are entirely within their rights if they choose to ban pupils bringing their mobile phones into the classrooms. But there is a real concern with this specific issue. There is a concern about what materials are getting taught in schools, and some schools which are refusing to share those with parents. I'm very clear that shouldn't be acceptable. The schools should be able to share what they teach and how they teach it with parents, and we need to make sure that's the case. And I think there was a recent legal judgment that actually opened some questioning in it. If that's the case, I think we should see the law change, because it is important that parents have the assurance that they know what is getting taught in schools, particularly on a contested issue such as this. And I think it is only fair to maximise the engagement and the involvement of parents.
I don't disagree with that, and not just parents, actually. Why shouldn't all of these teaching materials be widely accessible and available, and then we could all debate those. I have no problem with secondary age children having debates about contentious issues that are being debated in the House of Lords and probably in some pubs, but not most pubs, which are more worried about the cost of living crisis right now.
Some of the teaching materials are coming from outside organisations, and then they don't want to reveal their materials necessarily. There was a legal case with one parent who was aggrieved. I can't remember her name. It was a big case. She was aggrieved because her school was using these materials. They wouldn't allow her to view them for sex education classes, and she ended up losing her legal case because the charity or business was told that they didn't have to show them.
And that is where, if that's the case, I think the law should change to make sure that they do. Because
Raphael, you've written this big politics book. Do you think this is going to be a big issue at the next election?
No, I think there's polling that shows clearly what the issues are. I mean, people feel very strongly about the cost of living first, and then the state of the NHS second. And I think certainly there will be a feeling, people can be animated, and a small number of people can get very sort of frothy and outraged, and then sort of colonise the space in which debate happens on these issues.
OK.
But for most people, that's not their...
Thank you all for being so animated and in a perfect amount of time to bring us to the end of the show. Thanks for watching.